everybody. It's Isaiah, and I'm here with Chef B, who's going to tell us about one of our sponsors here. Chef?
Yeah, O&B Puckcast is now brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. The winter months can be especially hard on our homes, from roof damage and peeling siding to frozen pipes and toilet overflows. Call Summit Public Adjusters before you call your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be stressful and confusing. Let Summit Public Adjusters take the stress out of the claim process by having our guys work for you. Get the most for your money and your repairs. The next time the big snow or the rain leaves you with some home damage, contact us for a free consultation. Summit Public Adjusters are licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Learn more at summitpublicadjusters.com or call 215-752-0560. Just tell them that the chef sent you.
Yeah, what was that number again, Chef?
215-752-0560.
That's terrific. All right, we're going to carry on with the rest of our show. And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 144, brought to you by flyersnittygritty.com. And yeah, just a note before we get rolling. We have a great show tonight. We have a full panel and a special guest. The O&B Puckcast is on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. We're on 12 podcast platforms. Subscribe, follow, whatever applies. There's never a charge. And if you do so, it moves us up the charts for people that are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts. We appreciate that. If you could give us a rating on one of those platforms, particularly the Apple Podcasts or on YouTube. And YouTube, all you do is plug in O&B Puckcast, and you'll find us there. So we'll read the next Apple Podcast platform review that we get, and we appreciate that very much. And before we get rolling, just a reminder about Jim South Street, 400 South Street, 40 years of Philly cheesesteaks in the grandest edition. You know you got to have one. Fries and steaks and hoagies in tremendous Philadelphia style that you love. And if you live down near 400 South Street and you can't get over, no worries. They use DoorDash. So check out Jim South Street the next time you're in the area, 400 South Street in Philadelphia, PA. And with that, let's introduce our panel and let's say hello to Chef B. How are you?
Very good. Thank you.
Yes. And as always, the great Dan Silver.
I'm great, man. The Flyers have got a one-game winning streak going. Things couldn't be any better.
Yep. Great practice, I heard. It's fantastic practice. And with us again, we're so glad to have him back from 97.3 ESPN, Flyerdelphia, and so many other outlets. He is Kevin Durso. How are you, man?
I'm doing well, guys. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. Really, people got to make sure they follow Kevin, his stuff. I mean, that was a stellar article that you wrote about, I guess, the really biggest event. I guess it's true the Flyers broke their 13-game winless streak or losing streak, depending on how you look at it. And it was a fun game to watch. But really the story over the last week for the Flyers was the press conference, Kevin, with Dave Scott making a surprise appearance in the eyes of some, and Chuck Fletcher. And maybe we could hash through that, and people have to check out your piece on that fantastic piece at 97.3ESPN.com.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and there's so much. I think I was telling you before we started, it was 4,500 words to go through the whole thing, to break it down, to talk about what was said, what maybe wasn't said that maybe we were looking for, and to actually break down what I believed was more along the lines of being the right direction or truth, and what I thought was the farthest thing from it. You know, specifically, if I'm going to say the farthest thing from it, the Dave Scott comments about the attendance, for example, that was the farthest thing from the truth. But, you know, certainly he was a surprise to everybody. And I saw people, and I know people have probably preconceived notions out there about Dave Scott, and if your mind's made up on what you think of him, I would imagine, you know, you not love him, but you either really hate the guy and nothing he says is going to satisfy you or whatever. So I saw people who would comment and go, you didn't seriously buy the lip service at the beginning. And my answer to that is, it was kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You know, if he comes out and says that, he's saying, quite frankly, what I think needs to be said when you've lost 13 games in a row. We're angry. I know you're angry. I am sick of losing. This isn't the culture that Ed Snyder built. And I'm sorry. All those things are very good things to say because everybody's feeling that in some way, shape, or form. So whether you think it's lip service or not, he wasn't announced to be there. He could have sat in his plush office and been like the the meme of the dog in the burning house and been sipping his coffee during the morning instead. And it could have been Chuck Fletcher's the highest member of management that talks to the media, and instead he sat there and he wasn't a spectator following the opening statement. He took questions more than usual. So I do give him credit for that because he didn't have to be there. It wasn't announced previously, and so be it. But I didn't like the rest of his answers after that. I thought the rest of it was a disaster, quite frankly. I thought Chuck Fletcher said some good things at the beginning as well. The first couple answers about Sean Couturier and Ryan Ellis, the thoughts about shutting them down. Right answer. I think that you should shut them down for the rest of the year. You're not going anywhere, and everybody knows it. So don't force them back out there on the ice and put them at risk for anything more serious than what's going on right now. So that's the right answer. In talking about Claude Giroux, sounds like the team's got their mind made up about his future, but the ball's in his court with the no movement clause. So to sit there and tell you it's his choice, it's his choice. There's nothing you can do about that. He signed the contract long before Chuck Fletcher was here, so the no movement clause is what it is, and if he wants to move, then he has to sign off on it, but it sounds like the team's ready to move on. So all that stuff's good. And then we get into this, this aggressive retool and don't see a 3 to 5 year rebuild. And that was where you started to lose me because I'm not so sure, how one statement can be made and then the other goes with it. They don't match up. Everything that was said, one guy was saying one thing, another guy was saying another, and it didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I guess I share a lot of the same feelings that Kevin does about the press conference. One question I would ask is, when the Rangers did their whole rebuild thing where they basically, their early draft picks haven't even really worked out. Basically, they got lucky with with Panarin wanting to go there and Adam Fox only wanting to go there. But, they came out with that statement at the end of the one season, which was basically like, hey, we're going to trade all our guys and we're going to, get draft picks and bear with us, that kind of thing. They made that statement. One of the things as I'm watching this press conference is like, it seems to me that Dave Scott is not prepared to say something like that, like phrased with a question of, hey, Dave Scott, how do you view this? Is this a total rebuild or not? Like, even if it is going to be a total rebuild, I'm not sure that Dave Scott was ready to sit there in front of reporters and say, yes, we're doing a 3 to 5 year rebuild. Like, maybe there's a way he could have phrased that answer differently. But for me, him saying that didn't necessarily mean that they might not go down that path, if that makes any sense.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, there's elements to it that I wasn't sure I was buying everything they were selling there either. One other line that I'm sure other people are going to read a lot into was the Chuck's my guy right now line, and to sit there and say that means Chuck Fletcher's safe. I don't know that that's for sure and certain, to be honest. I think a lot of things can change in 3 months, and him saying that at the end of January is not the same as the end of April, quite honestly. I do think he's safe through an important part of this whole process, which is the trade deadline, and I kind of wonder if you're going to go down a road that we would all consider to be a rebuild, even if you don't say the word, is that the guy you want to handle probably the beginning stages of it, the trades that get the capital in, the assets, the draft picks and potential prospects? Is that what you want? It sounds like that's the case. And maybe, Danny Briere's name has come up a lot recently, and I know you guys know this, and, he's going to have some role with the team somewhere, really soon. I don't know what the title's going to be. They might not even put a title on it until after the season's over, but he's going to have a role because they almost lost him to Montreal. And I think that they realized they're lucky they didn't. So I don't know what that's going to entail, but I know that he's going to have some sort of involvement. And there's a lot of people that believe he's ready for some sort of management job. So I've been saying, one of the things I did when they got to the halfway point of the season, I did a 3 questions for the rest of the year article. And I put his name in there because if we're not 1,000% sure of what Chuck Fletcher's future is, even if Dave Scott says right now he's my guy, then Danny Briere's name is going to be all over the place in the next few months because of the fact that he's still here and everybody knows he's probably got a management future because he was a finalist for a general manager position with one of the most storied franchises in the game.
Yeah, it could be. Chef, I'm going to get you in a minute. I just wanted to hop on that point. Can you foresee a scenario where Fletcher kind of becomes the the president and overseer of someone who's inexperienced like Danny Briere, who's named the general manager, who handles some of those duties, and they both kind of share input on the moves for the team.
Yeah, I could probably see it, to be honest. I mean, it's not exactly foreign concept anymore. I think it probably would have been a few years back, but now, I mean, that's the situation in Pittsburgh with Ron Hextall and Brian Burke. And, not to say that Ron Hextall's a new to management like Danny Briere would be, but it gives you that guy who kind of oversees the process. And I do think that one of the elements, to me anyway, the reason why Dave Scott's going to sit there and tell you Chuck's my guy is because he's going to sit there and call it, the word he used was it's very collaborative. I think really what the story is, and this is where his comments, not only about the rebuild and not seeing it being a 3 to 5 year thing or whatever, and then later on the blank check comment, that to me says he's the one holding the keys, not Chuck Fletcher. So Chuck Fletcher's kind of, in a way, kind of a pawn. Like, hey, he's the guy who's the general manager, but at the end of the day, who's the one who might be signing off on the moves? Who's the guy with the blank check? And who's the guy who's probably saying we don't want to rebuild? I think that's kind of I thought that was an indication of what the state of the franchise kind of is that Chuck Fletcher talking about how do we don't have impact talent. Okay. You don't have top end impact talent. It's not a false statement. I think we can recognize that. How do you get it? High picks in the draft. I'm agreeing with everything he's saying at that point. He's talking about the way that I foresee that you get those kinds of players. And on the next breath, you got a guy who's going to tell you, but I'm ready to write the blank check for what? Which free agent that you think you're going to get to sign in Philly? That's not the way. I don't see it being a quick process. That's the thing to me. And to me, if that's the way that the so-called ownership group and the representative of ownership sees it, then that to me says he's the one who's making maybe the final decisions even more than the general manager is. And that's probably a scary thought right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chef?
Okay, my question would be that if you're keeping Chuck Fletcher through the trade deadline, and can we assume that he's going to be the one making the decisions in the near future or for this rebuild process? And would it have been a bad thing to actually just break down and say, hey, we're with your fans here. We don't like the product that's on the ice, and we want to change it. We want to fix it. We agree with you. It's going to take a rebuild. And, I think he's just worried about the financial aspect of it, about calling it a rebuild and thinking it's going to take 3 to 5 years or whatever. And in his mind, maybe that's what's in there. But I think do you agree that he would probably get a lot more feedback and respect from the fan base if he said, hey, look, we screwed up. It's not a good product as we thought it was going to be. Why not? Well, we're going to rebuild it, but it's going to take time, just like they did in New York almost.
I think that they would get a better reaction than most people think. Yeah, actually, I think that if you told people for the next 5 years, hey, listen, it's not going to be pretty, but this is going to be a process that we're working towards, especially when you consider where you could finish in rankings, what kind of pick you could get, especially next year, because this year's draft is going to be kind of average, but there's guys at the top end that you should still get a player. I don't want to sit there and tell you you're going to get your future, but you're not going to get a future. Maybe Shane Wright's the future superstar potentially, but that's probably about it. It's not a great draft. Next year's is going to be loaded potentially. And imagine if you come away from that draft and build your capital up, to get maybe 2 picks out of that draft, the way that they did, and they weren't in a rebuilding state at this time, but in 2003, when the draft was really good and they had 2 first-round picks turned into Jeff Carter and Mike Richards, not bad. And 7 years later, where were those two? They were playing in a Stanley Cup final. So you can get good talent like that. I really believe that if you told people who support this team through everything anyway, it's going to just take time. And yeah, the Rangers did it a few years ago. I've had people, because there's people who sit there and say, they probably don't want to try, there's no guarantees if you take that route. And if you take the Colorado Avalanche route where you get, hey, for 10 years, you were building it up. You finished close to last a couple of times. You picked really high, but you know what? You netted Landeskog, Rantanen, McKinnon, and Makar out of all those drafts. And, my answer to that is, have they won anything yet? No, they haven't. But when the regular season gets started or we're in preseason mode and people are picking who's going to be there at the end of the year, does anybody ever not say the Colorado Avalanche right now? Everybody does. So at the very least, you kind of get back to me anyway, the late 90s, early 2000s, where, every year people were talking about the Flyers in the Final Four potentially because that's the kind of team that they had. And, yeah, it's not the same because there was no salary cap then. They could go out and write the blank check for whoever they wanted and make it work. But Colorado is in the discussion every single year anymore. And eventually one of these years, it's probably going to amount to what they've wanted all these years. And I think that the people would love to see the Flyers in that situation again, where every year you're not wondering, are they going to make the playoffs or not? Is this the even number year where they make the playoffs? No, it's a given. They're going to make the playoffs. And then the question is, how far do they go? I think that's what people want to get back to. And it's kind of hard to see them getting there right now without going through such a process.
So I've got a couple quick things. So one is, I agree that I'd like them to do a rebuild, a true rebuild, a tear down rebuild, but it is a little harder to do that in this era than it has been in the past, mainly because of the contracts. Like, I just can't see anyone taking the Kevin Hayes contract or taking, the Ryan Ellis contract and Isaiah and I, and Chef have talked about this. I find it hard to believe someone would take the Couturier contract. Maybe they would, but it seems like those are three fairly good players when they're healthy who are, going to stand in the way just because you can't move their contracts of doing like a total rebuild. So it's sort of hard to like envision what a total rebuild kind of would be like. So like Kevin, if that's what you wanted to do, and I think all of us probably are in the same boat, like how would you go about doing that process?
So I think that there's a couple of different ways to look at it a little bit, because I agreed with some of the comments, and Chuck Fletcher talked about it when starting to get into that. It is impossible to truly bottom out the whole thing and just gut the whole roster. That's truly impossible. You're not just going to have 20 new guys next year, unless you become the Lehigh Valley Phantoms in the NHL, which, I mean, we've seen what that looks like with guys on the COVID list and things like that for a few games. So we've seen what that kind of looks like. To me, the initial plan, and to my knowledge, this is sort of the direction that the team is going to go to an extent. And I don't want to give too much to say that this is definitively what they're going to do, but this is how I would handle it. And I think some of it lines up with what I've heard they probably will look to do. And, the beginning is you've got, at the very least, I would say, notably 6 unrestricted free agents that should be all looked to be moved at the deadline in some way. And I know that there's going to be one name in particular, and it's actually not Claude Giroux, I'm going to say, but there's a name that's going to be out there that people are going to go, well, should they or shouldn't they? And that's Rasmus Ristolainen. I keep hearing what really is going to happen there is it's going to be treated kind of like Scott Lawton last season, where they'll wait it out. If something's going to be made at the deadline in terms of re-signing him, then it would happen right then and there. And if not, they'll move him. But I look at 50-50, and I kind of wonder if you should even consider re-signing him right now. I think that you should just look to unload these unrestricted free agents, because there is going to be a market for them. Claude Giroux is going to definitely have a market because of the fact that he's going to be probably, to me anyway, I'd struggle to find another name out there who's going to be more highly touted at the deadline than Claude Giroux. I mean, he's probably going to be the best player available among teams that are looking to move guys that are out there. And any playoff team out there would be crazy not to try to add a player like that. So he's going to net something to me that's relatively significant. Ristolainen I don't want to jump and say you're going to get a first-round pick back for him again, because that would be perfect world, but I'd hope that you would get something mildly significant, not near as much as you would get for Giroux, but possibly. And then I would just look at everybody else, and the names would probably be at this point. So Justin Braun's going to have maybe a market because teams don't mind adding a veteran third-pairing defenseman for the playoff run. If Derek Brassard can come back, and the word is he'll probably be back very close to after this weekend's All-Star break, if he can pick back up to the production level he was at before the injury, he's worth something in the middle. He's kind of like your Michael Raffle of last year. He'll be worth something, and you might as well take what you can get. I mean, I throw it out there and go, I don't think Keith Yandel's going to be worth anything at the deadline, but if someone out there is going to do what they did with Eric Gustafsson last year and say, here's a 7th, you're crazy not to take it and run. So that's what it kind of turns into. If you can get something for some of those guys, then by all means get it. And if not, you're going to let it run out, and you're going to just ride it out to the end of the year, and the contract's up and their money's off the books, and it's the end of story. And then from there, I mean, the other obvious move that's coming soon, and it'll happen probably almost immediately after the season, but they're going to almost definitely buy out James Van Riemsdyk after the season's over. It's pretty much a given at this point. So his money will be freed up. It's not going to be they'll have to have a bit of a cap hit the following year, but next year I believe it saves them something in the range of like $2.4 million toward the cap. So they'll open up a little bit of money there, and then start watching for names. When they brought up this core, and granted, I don't love hearing the guy who's the ownership representation try to tell me who the core of a hockey team is, but he tried, and he's mentioning Sean Couturier, Ryan Ellis, Joel Farabee, Kevin Hayes. Okay, that's fine. He left out Claude Giroux, which I think we all know why. That's probably, the end is near. And then he left out Ivan Provorov and Travis Konechny and Travis Sanheim. So don't be surprised if their names are floating around trade rumors, more likely in the offseason, but don't be surprised, because I think that there is a market for those guys too. I personally think that Konechny's on the way out, because they gave him a vote of confidence last offseason to come back, be the player that they saw in pre-COVID 2019, 2020, leading up to the pause. And he hasn't been that so far, obviously. And I think time's running out on that relationship as well. And that's not to say that somebody out there won't be willing to pay you something for him. I kind of see them trying to orchestrate a trade in that regard with anybody like that, with a Sanheim, with a Konechny. I think Provorov, they'd be really hard to move on. It'd be hard for them to make a trade unless they really get floored by an offer. So I don't think he's necessarily going anywhere. Just don't be surprised if he's shopped. But if Konechny or Sanheim do get traded, I'm thinking something more in the vein of, the Jake Voracek, Cam Atkinson type trade. It's going to be more of a classic hockey trade where money relatively evens out. Player talent or need for what kind of player you're looking for is going to relatively even out. So if it's Sanheim on the move and the Flyers let's say they want another center who can kind of fill in the hole between, say, Couturier and Hayes and give them more depth down the middle, then maybe Sanheim's the guy who goes, because that team needs a defenseman, or vice versa. They want another defenseman who can play, because imagine if they do trade Ristolainen at the deadline, let's say, and then they move Sanheim in the offseason. Then you realistically only have 3 defensemen going into the offseason. You're going to have Provorov, Ellis, and Cam York. And that's not to say I don't think Cam York should stick here for a while. I mean, he's definitely been a bright spot over the last few games in terms of how he's handled the workload, and he's got room to grow, obviously, but he doesn't look like he's lacking confidence. So that's always a good sign. But that's the only pieces I can think of on the blue line that would make it through if you moved Ristolainen and Ellis in trades, whether at the deadline or in the offseason or whatever, however it pans out. So you have to start thinking about that. You have to think about kind of what your roster is going to look like next season and where you're going to fill those holes in the lineup with, is it the back to the blank check comment and the free agents that are going to be out there, or do you actually get a trade that works out for both sides? If Sanheim goes somewhere or Konechny goes somewhere and has success, but you get somebody back that's had success the way that Cam Atkinson has and looks the part the way that you want Cam Atkinson to look as a veteran on a team that's going to certainly probably have some youth to it, then it can be a win-win for both sides still, and you can get something out of it that you want. But they really have to get a lot of it right, and I think the first thing that they got to get right is whatever they get back for Giroux, because that's going to set the tone for the whole thing.
So let me just ask a quick follow-up. Mm-hmm. So, we're talking about a rebuild and that agreeing that sort of high picks is the way to go. But what I'm hearing from you is, okay, we're going to make hockey trades for Konechny, Provorov, and Sanheim, which to me, you're saying like for like, right? Like if we're doing a rebuild, wouldn't we be better off trading those guys for high picks and prospects? You talk about buying out JVR. Again, to me, like if we're rebuilding and we need assets, wouldn't we be better off keeping him into next season and trading him before the deadline instead of trying to free up more cap space in the offseason to go after like Johnny Gaudreau or Nazem Kadri, who are going to help the team probably more than a JVR would? So I guess I'm just trying to reconcile, you talking about wanting to do a rebuild, but then also saying making hockey trades for these guys and going after free agents with an open checkbook.
Right. So I'll clarify a little bit, because this isn't necessarily me talking. This is what I understand their plan to be. So that's where the aggressive retool and the we don't see a 3 to 5 year rebuild kind of comes in. I don't think that that's the way to go, because I don't think that, Dave Scott's comment kind of was along the lines of we should contend next season. I think that that's delusional. I don't know how you're supposed to go from where you are now to that. This is, the comment that I kind of like to pull out is this isn't the NFL. You don't get the top draft pick and it's the guy who changes your whole franchise on a dime because he's that kind of talent. Like you're not going to pick first this year and get, say, Shane Wright, and all of a sudden be in the Stanley Cup final next year. That's not how it works. It takes years for some of these guys to come through and be that kind of talent level and things like that. So that's where the contradictions keep coming in for me, is that I think you need to try to have multiple years, particularly next year. Cause I chat with friends of mine and otherwise back and forth, because I got a friend who's a Boston fan, and there was a big whole thing on NHL Network about Giroux in Boston. So I just sat there and jokingly was pitching, almost like pitching trades. And I sat there and said, listen, if I'm Chuck Fletcher, if I'm in the GM's chair making that trade that involves Giroux, first thing I need is a first round pick back. I need a first round pick back. And you know what? I'd almost be tempted to not even worry about getting a first this year. I might want your first next year, because I'm told the draft is going to be better next year. So I want another pick next year, but I'm not going to just take no picks this year. I need something in the middle. I don't have a second or a third. So you know what, Boston, you have Calgary's third this year. I'll take that too. And then I know that Jake DeBrusk is probably on the block because he's been talked about forever. So I'll take him too. And that's where I would start. And there's even talk that it could be more than that. But that's kind of like the scenario where I see it playing out, where you get a player who can play now. He's not going to be Claude Giroux level, but he can play now, and he's going to be in the lineup. So so you don't have so you don't have Dave Scott nudging your general manager about Jerry Mayhew necessarily. Like that's kind of where I'm at with that. Like you need to have players who legitimately fill an NHL lineup, and they're not going to be game changers, but they're legit NHL players. And then I start looking at picks in those deals, and I start to almost gear myself towards the following year's draft and building capital for that. But that means I'm building towards something beyond this offseason, which is kind of the opposite of what I was hearing in that press conference, which is, basically when that blank check comment comes out like that, who's the first name that came to mind? And Dan said it, Johnny Gaudreau is the guy. And everybody's going to say that for months and months on end. It was being said before this season even began, I think, because of the way that it was, the offseason was, here comes all of the BC guys. Here comes all Kevin Hayes' friends, from things like, and it's still going to be Hayes and Atkinson and guys like that. And you're going, it still would, like, from that angle, it still makes a ton of sense to think that he's going to have like a recruiting train out there for him. I don't know if it makes a ton of sense for where they're at. And I don't know that Gaudreau would want to play here right now either. If Gaudreau's at a stage of his career where he wants to win, how do you convince him that it's going to happen in the next, say, 3 to 5 years? I have trouble finding a way to convince people of that. So that's kind of why I find it contradictory. If you're going to try to go for it and do all of that type of stuff and make hockey trades that fill your lineup and maybe sign a few guys, then it sounds like you want to compete right away. And I'm just not sure that it almost sets you up for the disappointment that we felt kind of as the years going on, because certainly, I mean, whether they made the playoffs or missed the playoffs barely, I think that was always kind of a discussion. I think, you guys had me on, I think right before the season started, and I kind of didn't answer the question about where they could finish, because I told you they could be second, they could be seventh. This could either work out really well or this could be a total disaster. But, I think that's part of the problem, is that we don't really know where they're supposed to go. And it turned into a massive disappointment, because this is where they are right now. They're bottom 5 in the league. And yet the talk was that they weren't supposed to be. They made all these changes. It was half the roster turned over. So I think if you try to turn over half the roster kind of the same way, it's more Band-Aids in the process. It's just trying to put. I made a joke on when I do the You Would Think podcast. I made the joke that I said, this is the guy in the infomercial who's got the tape that he puts over the leak and magically it disappears. It's like you're trying to stop the water from gushing out of the crack in the foundation here a little bit. So that's kind of the way that I view what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's it, Kevin. And in your article, you talked about, like, they've been turning over this thing for so long. They've already been doing a rebuild just because they didn't say it. When you turn over that many players in one season, when you've had 3 out of 4 bad seasons, all disappointments, I mean, bracketing 20 is the one exception. And it seems like the bubble broke them, and they haven't been the same. They've never recovered. And the big position for me is the center position, where they're slow, they're plodding, and their players are getting older, and they need some dynamism down the middle with some youth. And it's a big problem. We see that on the power play. And when your power play is not working and you're otherwise not a really dynamic team, it gives you no margin for error. And they're going to have to address that. And that might be the appeal of somebody like Johnny Gaudreau, but that's only on the power play. Again, that center position is so key for them, and it's been a problem this year.
Yeah, so here's the thing that I feel about that, because what Gaudreau fits if they were to go after him, and again, I'm not saying this is always the mode to go here, but if they like Gaudreau is going to be that, and Fletcher said a couple of times talking about shoot first guys like Atkinson. Well, Gaudreau is going to solve that problem because I don't get to see him in person all that often. I'm down there most nights. The only game I've missed this season, I didn't go Saturday. They won a game for the first time in a month, and I didn't go because of the snow. But go figure. But the game that Calgary played earlier in the year, Johnny Gaudreau had, I think, 10 shots on goal. I mean, and down to, I walked away from it, and I told somebody else who was up there, he was the best player on the ice until he turned it over in overtime. That was the story. They were in a tie game. He was the best player on the ice, and he turned it over in overtime, and you can't do that. And that was the only mistake he made on the night. He looked like he was destined to score a goal. He didn't score the goal, but he looked close to destined for it. And so does he solve the shoot first thing? Sure he does, because that's his style. But is he in this physical mold? And he's not a center, obviously, so you got to fill those areas as well. Kadri was an interesting name when it came up when I heard it, because he's physical, certainly. I mean, he's kind of towed the line with the Department of Player Safety more than a few times. So he's physical. He would definitely fit that mold, and he certainly can provide some offense. But it's just curious to me because of the fact that it doesn't really seem like it matches the direction. I would agree in 10 years ago, I guess, maybe when, Ed Snyder still kind of had his handprints all over the roster a little bit. Yeah, I think Kadri would be the type of guy in a free agent market that was destined to be a flyer, if you will. But I don't know about that anymore. The game's changed so much, even in 10 years. And every team I watch that has a power play usually against the Flyers. I watch a lot of other games too, but usually when I'm watching them against the Flyers, there's so many moving parts that the Flyers don't have. Guys are all over the place. Nobody's stationary. Nobody just is waiting for something to open up by happenstance, I guess I would say, as opposed to making it happen. You see a team like Colorado go around. I think Colorado even scored a power play goal here, and it was a game that they were going to end up losing anyway because it was the day Vigneault got fired, so they were all in shambles anyway. But Cale Makar just skates through the neutral zone like it's nothing, and when you have speed like that, he could have skated in and put the brakes on and stopped, and then circled around with everybody else 5 times over before they found a way to score a goal. And it would have worked out the same way and had the same end result, because that's the kind of skill level that you see teams have on power plays. They don't just stand in one spot, unless you're Alex Ovechkin, who can stand in the same spot and wait for the pass and everybody knows what's coming and you still can't stop it because you're generational. But, other than that, you got Nathan McKinnon, for example. Is he stationary on a power play? No, he's in 5 different spots at one time sometimes, because he's going to start over on the left side maybe, or he'll go to the net front and he'll end up at the top point, almost quarterbacking it, because that's how they run a power play. They move because they know if you just stand there stationary, it's really easy for a penalty kill to just get aggressive and pressure you into a mistake. If you're moving all the time, then they lose their structure and it opens up seam passes, backdoor plays. You've got wide open nets for goals, because that's what's going to happen when you create like that. So I always have thought for the entire year as I've watched this team that they've lacked that creativity, that they lack that skill. I sit there and I flipped over to, I forget what game it was I think it was in the middle of the Islander game on Tuesday, but I think I watched the overtime of Carolina Vegas, and I sit there and I look at that and I go, that game, that overtime, that game, it's entertaining as hell watching teams with so much high-end talent just go at it toe-to-toe like that. And that's the stuff that makes me wait for the playoffs to watch teams like that. But it's, maybe I yearn for it even more as I watch it then, because of the fact that I'm not seeing it. I sat there on Monday night and I watched the Flyers and the Stars play to a 1-1 tie into the final 4 minutes of a game, or some of the other ones earlier this month even. I mean, what was the Flyers played the Sharks on the same night that there was an Eagles game across the street, and everybody was more invested in the meaningless football game because there was nothing happening in 2 periods during the game was in front of us. So you need an entertainment value to it. And certainly, I came away from one of the first games of this losing streak that just ended was against Anaheim. That team, and they were missing Zegras that night too with COVID and all that stuff, but that team's entertaining as hell, and they're going to be fun to watch if they make the playoffs, and I hope they do, because those are the types of teams that are up and coming that I sit there and I kind of profiled them in takeaways after that game. Look at how they got where they are. They weren't great for several years, and then they draft names like Troy Terry was one of their original, they drafted him, and he's turning into something. He's an all-star this year. And Zegras should be. He's probably, and he will be somewhere down the line, I'm sure. I mean, he's doing the things he's doing. He'll be in an all-star game somewhere eventually. So he's a guy. And Drysdale, he's going to be a stud on the blue line. That's their cornerstone blue liner for years to come. And how do they do it? Zegras was a 9th, I think, and Drysdale was a 3rd overall. Like, that's where you pick them. You pick them in the top 10, and this team's had 2 top 10 picks in the last decade. And, Ivan Provorov's still here and plays a lot of minutes. And look, I give him credit for standing in there and not missing games and hating missing games for all the, for the reasons that he did and stuff like that. But, the other top 10 pick that they've had in the last decade is no longer here, and we all know who it is. And it's a guy who has been talked about by other members who aren't even always as present in the organization as they used to be. So his name still comes up, even though, he's not here anymore. So that kind of tells me where they're at in terms of how they've drafted, how they've developed. And they talk about the resource. That was another topic in the press conference, the resources that they have in these areas and how they're trying to double the resources in that. It's all well and good, but you're not developing players like the Tampa Bay Lightning are or other teams like that. You're not there. So I really need to start seeing results before I can kind of deem that you're building it the right way, per se. Like, I think you need to kind of get some of those picks that, and it would be great if they could luck out the way the Rangers kind of did to, Panarin wants to play there and Fox would only go there. So you got those players way ahead of schedule. So you know what happens when you draft 2nd overall and 1st overall and they're not even your top players? People are okay with it because they're willing to be patient with those guys because Kreider's carrying the load or Zibanejad's carrying the load or Panarin's doing it or whatever. Like, you're still a contending team with Lafreniere on your 3rd line. Like, think about that. He's a 1st overall pick and he's on your 3rd line and you're in the top 5 in the league because there's no pressure for those guys. They don't have to be the go-tos yet. They may be down the line, but they don't have to now. And that's a great problem to have for the Rangers, but I don't know if the Flyers are going to find that kind of luck in the next 5 years by just magically getting a couple of top picks, even if they got a guy, even like next year. Bedard's the name. Everybody knows Connor Bedard's the name that's going to come out of that draft next year. And he's going to probably be a generational type talent. But is that going to solve all your problems? It's not a one-player situation. I think we've all seen that with Edmonton. So, that's kind of where I'm at with where they are with this build. And certainly I would hope that they can develop some players too, because they really need to show that side of things as well. Because it's not just as simple as picking at the top and assuming it's going to work.
Well, we've seen that, like you referred to, Chef.
My question would be, because you mentioned it, they did turn over nearly half the roster in this offseason, and we're saying we don't think they will do it again, but thinking about what we're talking about, it sounds like we think they should do it again and change it again. And if we're so concerned with how upper management is managing their resources, in particular player development, how does that bear for these younger guys that we have hopes for that are still here, like Forrester or Des Donné? I mean, are these things that we should be worried about? If Danny Briere is going to be moving to a different location, how much faith is left in Lappy down in AHL to actually make that difference?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I kind of view, I'm not sure what Lappy's future is at all, to be honest, because, I mean, again, your ownership representation at this press conference basically said in no certain terms that the coaching staff is gone after this season. So nice to know that you've got 40 some odd games left at that time, and the coach and Mike Yeo is going to have to coach it out, and his time's going to be up at the end of the year, essentially. Like, how does that feel if you're the guy who's got that job at the moment and you pretty much have already been told, maybe not even directly, just overhearing through a press conference, pretty much you're a lame duck at this point. I wonder the same thing about the minor league coaching side of it. I don't know if that's going to be anything. I mean, they've at least been more competitive recently than others. I mean, I don't want to sit there and make it seem like they're a great team down there either. They definitely have some things that they need to work out on that end as well. I mean, for a guy like Forrester, I just wish he would stay healthy. And I think every time it's not been through any fault of his own. It's their shoulder injuries, which I think are just results of kind of freak plays that just happen. He's not doing anything. It's not the same thing that like Kevin Hayes is going through right now, where the wrong move puts you on the shelf for 4 weeks or something like that. I think it's just freak things because he's got a shot. He looks like he's got an NHL quality shot, and he certainly looks like a guy who could help the team. I almost wouldn't have been surprised if he would have found a way to be called up by the end of this season if he would have stayed healthy, because I think he would have made enough noise down there that they're going to sit there and start to weigh the who do you give a shot to just to see what you got. I think he would have probably crossed that line at some point if he was healthy. And, so those guys, I mean, you have to hope that you're putting the right guys in place. I'd love to know if there's going to be any, I don't know anything as of right now, but I'd love to know if there's going to be anything else in terms of hires down the road. I mean, right now it's still pretty much the same cast of characters that we hear about at development camps and things like that. Like Shel Samuelson running a lot of things with that and stuff. That's not to say they don't do a decent job with it, but you could always get better at everything. So who can you put in there to try to help out with that? And to an extent, Briere has even helped in that avenue because he did stand on the bench for the Phantoms for a couple games as a coach, kind of. So it's like he kind of has his hand in a little bit of everything. He's tried coaching a little bit. The story is he's scouting now a little bit, and he certainly handled day-to-day hockey operations management in his role with the Maine Mariners. So he's got a couple of different avenues he could go in. Maybe he's going to be a jack of all trades for them to an extent. And I kind of would love to see it because I think that the thing about him that I like in management, if they were to keep Briere around in some role, is I think he can communicate with today's player better. Yeah. I think that that's something that's important. And these young guys, I think, and I'll use the two names that Chef mentioned, the Forster or Desnoyers, like, I think that they would resonate with some of that. Desnoyers especially. I mean, Desnoyers, who's a French-Canadian, kind of has that same background that Briere did. I mean, imagine having somebody who's going to talk to you who went through all the years that he played and tell you this is what it's like. And he didn't play. It's not like he played that long ago. He's got recent enough playing time, Briere does, that you can relate to what guys are doing today and kind of see where it was starting to shift when your final years were up before you entered this venture in the management side of things. So I think that that's an important part of it too, that he's got elements where he can contribute in that way.
Yeah. Chef.
If we're talking about, you mentioned lame duck coaches. If we are talking about that, and things can change, I guess, but I'm wondering, is like all the rumors that happened, and even NHL Network made a joke about it, where like, hey, where's Tocchet at when they came back from break? Oh, I had to take a phone call, that kind of thing. Is Rick Tocchet really a viable option for this team? I mean, does it make sense? I know he's a fan favorite. He can, but if you do, do you do the 1-2 punch? Do you bring in Rick Tocchet as your coach and Danny Briere as maybe your AGM or GM in training or whatever you want to call them? And now you have two people in this organization that are not so far along, that has really league respect, not just local guys, league respect. How do you think that that's even a possible option, or how viable is any of that?
I think Briere's more viable than Tocchet is. And that's not to say I don't think Tocchet's a possibility, but I'm not so sure that that's exactly what's going to happen. And, Tocchet, they obviously played into it when all that stuff happened because his name was everywhere. And I do think there's an element to me, like Tocchet would be a more viable option in my eyes than a lot of names that everybody else seems to want to throw out there. And I hear it a lot. Like everybody's going to say, why not Tortorella? Why not Claude Julien? Why not? And my answer to that is, last thing I want right now for where I think the team should be is a guy who comes in and he's known for being the guy who gives you a kick in the rear end and it's go time. I don't think they need a coach who is ready to win now the way that, even Alain Vigneault was that. Alain Vigneault was the top 10 in wins in NHL history, kind of, that's where he ranks. What's the next step for him? Try to win a Stanley Cup. Well, this team I don't think is there. So you need a guy who's much more lowers the expectations even from a coaching standpoint. And Yo kind of does a little to that extent, but I don't think it's working out here either because he's been on the staff for 3 seasons. Now you got him in the head coaching role, and they pretty much already said, like I said, in no certain terms, that they've made their mind up on him. So it's going to be somebody else. There's, you could go that. I think you could go the route of, say, if you went the route of a Tocchet where there's a little bit of history involved, I think that helps a little bit in terms of where the fan base is at from an apathy standpoint, because, as much as people kind of got tired of the old Flyers club, if you will, I think that there's an element of it that people would appreciate, knowing the way that things kind of are right now. I mean, one of the things that Dave Scott said during the press conference was we need to communicate better with the fans. Well, communication can't be that good if, it's Monday night, the losing streak's at 11. It's going to be 12 by the end of the night. So you're going to be tied with the franchise record. They go on to set the record the next night. And it's an hour and a half before that game on Monday against Dallas, and you released a video game that stars your mascot. That's really good communication. That's reading the room.
Oh, the gritty snacks.
Yes, that's reading the room really well. So I think that if they had a guy who was kind of like, again, and Briere fits the mold too to that extent too. If Briere's your like assistant general manager or has ties to it in some way, maybe he is the general manager, and Chuck Fletcher, like we've said, maybe Chuck Fletcher's the president of hockey ops, and so Briere's got a role that involves day-to-day operations with how the team is put together. He's involved just as much. So if you put a guy like that, there's a former Flyer. Let's hypothetically say it was Tocchet. I don't know that it's going to be for sure, but if Tocchet's the guy behind the bench and it's another former Flyer, as much as that kind of speaks to the old school way of thinking, it's also going to give people an idea that it's a little bit more like Ed Snyder's culture again. This is what they do. It's kind of the family atmosphere again, because right now it doesn't even feel like the family atmosphere. So that's a big problem you got to correct, and that would I think at least it creates some building blocks for repairing some of it. It doesn't completely repair it because, as Dave Scott said, what is one part of the attendance? It's the product. So if the product's not good, people aren't stupid out there. And I've known this for years, as long as I've been covering the team, and before that when I was watching like everybody else was. If they're good, everybody shows up religiously. It is that kind of level of support that you get for a team like this. So to see most recently the Monday night game where there was no excuses for anything, there's no weather outside, there's nothing else going on that should derail attendance on any other given night, and the paid attendance was only 14,500, let alone the actual attendance, which probably was more in the range of like 9,000, which now we're teetering into Arizona Coyote territory. Like that's what actual crowds for the Coyotes and the Florida Panthers look like. And everybody used to, we would all sit around and say, look at the way that is. They got more Flyers fans down there at those games than they have their own fans. It's starting to turn into that in Philadelphia, which is a scary thought for the way that everybody religiously would go down and how often they would sell out the building, even during awful years like in 06 or in 07, 08 or 06, 07, or 06, 07, when they got Van Riemsdyk out of that year's draft. The pretty much the worst year in Flyers history that anybody can remember, just for where they finished, how many wins they had, points they had, everything. And somehow or other, this is turning out to be worse because of the way that they market the team. It's almost like there's no way that the team has any sense of direction because of the fact that there is no going up right now. It needs to really be built back up to that. And that again is a scary thought to me, because how long does it take to do that? And that's where I got really confused by the lack of a 3 to 5 year rebuild comment, because I see things that this is a long-term rebuilding of not just a roster, but of a fan base to an extent. Make people want to come down again. And you're not going to really make people want to keep coming down as long as the focus is on what it's been on for more than just this season. It was into last season. I remember making a comment about how, it's the middle of March at that point. Fans are just allowed back in the building for the first time in over a year. And you're struggling to sell out 3,500 seats. I'm not seeing... There's 3,500 people who are allowed in the building, and I'm not seeing a full section of those. I'm not seeing that group reach 3,500, and I'm seeing of the people that do show a decent amount of people who are there for the other side, and that means that you've lost track. Like you've almost lost the amount of care that goes into when you run something like this. Who are you trying to entertain at that point? Are you trying to actually cater to your own fans, or is it just they showed up and they paid for their tickets and they paid for the parking and they did that? So again, like I said, what Dave Scott could have done instead of doing the press conference, he could have sat in the plush office and checked the financial reports of people who are not Flyers fans who are showing up just as much as as Flyers fans are. But I digress on that one. He did show up to the press conference, so that's why we're talking about a press conference.
No, that's understandable. Dan?
Yeah, a few questions. So one is with Giroux, are you pretty confident that he is going to waive his no movement clause?
Yeah, I think so. And I kind of, one of the comments I made recently was, to me, he just turned 34 a couple weeks ago. And I think he looks like the oldest 34-year-old I've ever seen, with the wear that it's just had of going basically to sit there and look at this season and kind of sit there and go, this again? Like, as if last year wasn't bad enough. This again? Like, the guy just wants to win. I mean, I can't believe there's a guy out there like him who's the game was over. There was a game that was over. I think it was the Columbus game, I guess. It was the 2-1 Columbus loss because they're down by a goal, but the puck's in the neutral zone with 5 seconds left. They're going to lose again at that point. And he's diving to block a shot for an empty net as if the -1 goal differential is any difference than -2. Like it really didn't matter to everybody else who was sitting there, but to him it did. And that's a guy who just wants to go and win. So I think that as you get closer, the desire for it is just going to outweigh everything. And one of the other things I've also been asked, and I don't know if I'm going to steal your question, Dan, or not, but I get asked a lot, if he does go somewhere else, is it possible that he would come back in the offseason? And I made a comment about that that's basically relates to a trade that happened last season. Columbus moved Nick Foligno at the deadline to Toronto for a playoff run. And he didn't end up re-signing in Toronto, so he was back on the market, and he ended up in Boston instead. And John Tortorella that day when he got traded from Columbus said, so it's all right, though, because we know we'll see him again. And the harsh reality is they never come back. They go somewhere else. They get a taste for it somewhere else, and they never come back at that stage of their career. So if Giroux goes, the next time you see him associated with the Flyers and signing something, it's probably the one-day contract at the end of the whole thing. And he signs and rides off into the sunset at the end of his playing career because he did spend so much time here. And I know that there's people who kind of question whether he's going to move or not because he's built his family here. That's true. But I think that his family knows the desire that he has to win. And I don't know where it's going to be because there's going to be a lot of suitors out there because, NHL Network talked up Boston. Colorado's in on everybody. It feels like they're going to be in on him if they can make the money work. And there's probably
Minnesota.
I said probably about a half dozen other locations. Yeah. Minnesota, I would include. There's probably about a half dozen others that I would say, apply in this situation that are going to be in. And that's why I think he's like, I kind of look and people go, really? You think that they're going to get that much back for Giroux? Yeah, I do. Because the market's going to be crazy for him. I think there's a lot of places that are going to be out there calling Chuck Fletcher, asking what it takes, because that's the type of guy, I don't care where you pick. I said in Boston, can you imagine, whether, because someone's going, would he play center? If he did, look who he'd be playing center with. He's going to be probably center in a second line in the old Krejci role with Taylor Hall on one side and Craig Smith on the other. It's a pretty good second line. In Colorado, he'd be on the wing with Kadri in the middle and probably Burakovsky. Again, that's dynamite for a playoff team. Like, he's going to bolster somebody's lineup incredibly. So I do think that when it comes down to it, his desire to be on a winning team and have a shot is going to outweigh everything else, and he will do it in due time. But I also think that they can honor his career in the right way, which is that they can kind of hold the keys to it too. And he's going to, I believe he would reach 1,000 games played 2 games before the deadline. Let him play his 1,000th game here. There's really no rhyme or reason to what you're going to get. First of all, you can't do it now anyway, because if you try to trade him now, then you're just going to look desperate and the package won't be near as good. And that's one way to, I kind of said this deal's going to set the tone for everything else moving forward. That's one way to botch this one, is if you get desperate early. So let it play out. Let him play. Let him keep building his stock, because he's going to. Because, it's pretty evident at this point. He's still going to be able to score goals and help provide points, even if they're losing games. He's doing it either way. So he'll continue to build his stock. And then you can have the big the thing plays out perfectly. His 1,000th game, I think, is going to be against Nashville like 3 days before the trade deadline. The next night they're in Ottawa. And then you have a Sunday afternoon game the day before the deadline where you could even have the deal done and not play him and walk him out to center ice at the Wells Fargo Center, give him the silver stick for the 1,000th game, and let him walk off into the sunset. That's the end of his Flyers career. And it would be a pretty good way to go out in the middle of an awful year otherwise, for him to go to a contender with that mark, with that milestone reached. 1,000 games, only 2 players in franchise history will be able to say that. And that would be a pretty fitting way for him to go out, in my opinion. So that's the way I kind of see, or I don't see it playing out that way, I should say. That's the way I hope it plays out, because I think he deserves that.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'd all love to kind of see it play out that way, or at least make sure that we get something. I've heard from reasonably good sources that him and his wife really like the area. Obviously, we see all these videos on social media of him with his young kid being out on the ice, and he's got 2 kids now. And I've heard that those considerations may be stronger than for some other players in the past. So that's sort of where I guess, worry sometimes that maybe he wouldn't waive the no movement clause. I assume he would. And I agree with you that it almost never happens where someone gets traded at the deadline and then comes back and re-signs in the offseason. But it does happen. It has happened before with some guys. I'm not necessarily saying that it would in this case, but I guess I would say that I do still have some concerns about him potentially not waiving the no movement just based on what I've heard. I assume he will, but I don't know. And I also hear what you're saying. And this is the fatalism of being a lifelong Flyers fan creeping is I'm sort of expecting like Giroux and Ristolainen to both suffer like season-ending injuries, in the next month and a half. That's sort of what I'm expecting.
I mean, if that happened and I'm sitting up in the press box and on the night that it happens, I would probably just shake my head and acknowledge that it was so fun, because I've done it times in other areas of the game. Dallas's first goal was on a breakaway, and the guy Rupe Hintz didn't even have control of the puck at center ice, and he has time to regain it, and he wasn't even across the blue line yet. And in my head, I'm going, goal, here it comes. Like, it becomes that predictable. So if something were to happen and Claude Giroux goes off, he almost did actually in the same scenario I was talking about with his wrist, and you're sitting there going, oh, geez. Like, we all know where the guy's season looks like it's heading in terms of he's going to be the most talked about name at the deadline. Please don't come out tomorrow and say he's got to be held out for 2 to 3 weeks or 3 to 4 weeks, and there goes all the time leading up to the deadline. So I totally get that line of thinking. And you know what I wonder too, kind of to an extent, to kind of help you out there, Dan, with like what you kind of the scenario you're playing out, because yes, he does have, like, would he look at his life situation and consider Philly to be the perfect place to be forever? I almost wonder if he could lean on a guy like Keith Yandel, who has kind of become roommates with Kevin Hayes again and has a wife and 2 daughters, who made an appearance at Saturday's game honoring him for getting to the Ironman streak. And so he's not living with them right now while the season plays out, but he's at a stage of his career that I think represents where Giroux is going to be next year and maybe a couple years down the road. Like, I think he's still got 3-4 good years left in him, but I think you can also kind of sit there and go, you know what, this is what he has to do for his job. And when it's all said and done, they probably all film in the past. I wouldn't be shocked if somebody in the organization isn't looking at him when his playing time is done and saying, we'll give you something to do. I don't even know what area they would target for him, whether it would be in player development or something else, but I'm sure he's the type of guy they're going to sit there and say, you've got a job somewhere after it's all said and done. But in terms of playing, most of the examples that I saw of guys who do re-sign after long-term things are kind of in the final year of it. I think the most obvious one was Patrick Marleau got traded from San Jose the second time around from San Jose to Pittsburgh, and then came back to San Jose really quickly for like one more year. And then it was all over anyway. And I think somebody else had texted me about one at one point in time and said Thomas Plekanec, and he played like 3 games going back to Montreal after all that. So it shows you how close to the end of the line those guys were, that it kind of was more the ride into the sunset at the end than actually coming back at, say, age 35 like Giroux would be, and still having some good years left. Because I truly believe that if the whole situation and whole scenario was totally different, and this team had much more of a future and was in contention, and Drew's status wasn't in question, does he have enough good years left in him to start to potentially challenge Bobby Clark's number? Quite possibly. I mean, he's going to break those numbers eventually in terms, like, he's going to get to 1,000 points. Not going to be going to get to 1,000 points with the amount of years he has left. And certainly I've talked myself into this more and more as I go through it. If he wins somewhere else, I know everybody kind of dreads it, but at the same time, this is a fan base that got really genuinely excited for Kimo Tiemann when he went somewhere and had his shot and won, because he deserved it all those years. If he goes and wins somewhere else, he's got a Hall of Fame case. 1,000 games, 1,000 points, probably Stanley Cup. He's probably got more of a Hall of Fame case if he can find a way to win somewhere. It's just not going to be here. That's the thing I keep coming back to, is it's not going to be here, but he's going to have more and more of a Hall of Fame case if he goes and does that, because that I think is going to be the missing piece. And I think if he does win somewhere, a lot of people who make those decisions about the immortality of the Hockey Hall of Fame are going to look at his career and go, you know what? Yeah, he did it all. So I think that's another thing to kind of weigh out as this whole situation plays out.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, Claude is super competitive, and he's going to have a legacy kind of mindset right now, and he should definitely. That's all the questions from me. Chef, do you have one?
We had talked. I'd asked the question other media outlets and other people we've had on the shows over this season. I thought that maybe Giroux, if he does stay here,
would he end up being that Bobby Clark of our generation that signs on for life and finishes his whole life around here, like much like Bernie does too, and several of the old crew. I mean, is it the worst situation? The fact that he doesn't waive that no trade clause and takes the hometown discount for 4 years just so he can break Bobby Clark stuff and possibly I mean. That I only bring it up because that's exactly what could happen to all of us, just because it's the worst thing that could possibly happen, possibly.
So here's the best way I can go with this one, which is, certainly there's always that's always an option that's on the table, because if he decides if the ball's in his court, like Chuck Fletcher says it is, and he decides this is where my life is and I don't want to go anywhere else. That's for him to decide. I think the competitive nature of him is going to make him go somewhere else. Although the reason I keep coming back to whenever he's done, this is probably where he ends up anyway, is because of the fact that, he wouldn't be the only one who left the Flyers after having a long time playing career and then turned out he came back anyway and had a role in some way. I mean, that's, Bernie Parent didn't play his entire Flyer career, his entire NHL career with the Flyers, obviously, and he's here. I think of a Brian Propp, because Brian Propp did most of his, most of his career achievements were Philadelphia, but he did play elsewhere and then ends up back in the area, and ends up being around the Flyers and things like that. And I think of guys like that when I think of Giroux and what would happen beyond the playing days anyway. But I do think that the competitive nature for him is going to go out there, and the funny part is that to also answer the question, it's not like it doesn't make sense if he did sign on a hometown discount, given the comments that were made. If you're going to talk about the four currently injured guys who are part of the said core, and you're going to talk about aggressively retooling and not a 3 to 5 year rebuild, then I kind of look at it and go, how is Claude Giroux not part of that picture then? Because he does make your team better than probably a lot of what you're going to get out there. So if that's your message, it's a little hard for me to believe that he's not part of the picture. The way that I see the direction, or the way I think the direction should go, he's the first guy I'm trying to move because of the fact that I know he's going to net you the most in return. So that's why I toy with that one, because the comments that are being made make it really hard for me to believe that somehow he's not actually part of the core. To sit there and talk about a team that you think is going to aggressively retool and somehow he's not in the core is almost a foreign concept for the last decade. And yet he's the first guy on my mind when I think about expiring UFAs and trying to build this thing back up, because he's going to get you, I think, exactly what you need. I think he's worth exactly what you need anyway. And it's why it's the most important deal to make, because if you don't get that's why I keep saying, if you don't get this one right, that could set them back pretty far in what they're trying to do, because he's going to get you. I can't see how they trade him, and there's not a first round pick involved in that deal. I just can't see it. And even if it's for something, even if it's for one this year, then that's the way it goes. And it's still a first round pick, and I'll still take it. But certainly I can't see how there's not one in there. And if it's anything less than that as a starting point, I'm going to probably be very critical of the deal, because I think that that's where you've got to start, with where they are and with what they should do and how they should move forward. So that's where I'm at. And it's funny, every time whether I'm on 97.3 or whether I do You Would Think or whatever, every time we bring up this scenario of Claude Giroux playing in anywhere else, and I'm kind of more the realist whenever I do these things, because I bring it up and talk more about it like it's going to be a given, how I probably understand what he's feeling in terms of his competitive nature. And sorry, it's not going to happen here. Like I kind of very bluntly state those things, but it is going to be weird whenever he does play for somebody else and we all turn on the television during the playoffs, let's say, and there he is. Like, it's going to be very strange, but I think that's where you're at as a franchise. And I don't think you can move forward with him as part of the core for what you got to do. So that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, this is, it's been fantastic, man. I really appreciate you coming on. All of us do, you put so much energy into what you're doing, and that comes across. We don't have to tell you, right? So 4,500 words, the masterpiece over at ESPN.com, 97.3ESPN.com. So before you go, you got to tell the people where they can follow you, and you got some podcast things going on. So we got to keep up with you. How can they do that?
Sure thing. So on Twitter, it's at Kevin _Durso. You can read everything over at 97.3ESPN.com, sportstalkphilly.com. The Flyerdelphia is the Flyer page of that, if you will. And the You Would Think podcast, we do show every week. We record on Sunday mornings typically. We spend a good amount of time doing the same thing you guys are, talking about this press conference and all that type of stuff, talking about the losing streak and all that type of stuff. I will say one of the things I said on that podcast a couple weeks back, they were lining up for a week against Anaheim, and the games kind of had San Jose was at the end of that. Pittsburgh was on there too. And I said, trying to be as smart as I can. I'm not always the smartest guy in the room. I'll admit that. I was seeing they had already lost to San Jose previously. They had lost to LA going in. I went, I see a 5-game losing streak. And then I look at the following week, and they had, prior to a postponement, they had Carolina and the Rangers were on there, and Boston was on the schedule. And I went, I think that might get it to 8. And then I just kept going. And I really didn't expect a franchise record losing streak at the start of that. But I did sense an 8-game losing streak when they lost to San Jose and LA and looked at the teams they were playing coming up. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's more. I don't want to say they're going to have another 10-game losing streak. I don't know if I'm going to, I'm not the betting type per se. So I'm not going to I wouldn't put my life savings on something like that, but they're going to play tough teams a lot in a row. So I think that's kind of the way that this season's going to go. And the trade deadline and the offseason are going to be the things to look forward to, because that's where pretty much where all the work's going to have to be done. Maybe a little bit of magic too, just to come out on the other side with some positivity. But it's always fun talking with you guys, always fun talking about anything like this, because, I just appreciate having involvement in any way I can. So thanks for having me again, guys.
I appreciate it. You had one more thing?
Yeah, just because the one more thing I wanted to mention on the show was, and it's not a question, it's sort of a comment that I think Kevin will get a kick out of too, was I saw this tweet today from, Charlie O'Connor, who we love at The Athletic. The tweet was, "This is not a quote, everything is great, gang," end quote tweet. But I will say that this is the sharpest Flyers practice I've watched in months. Funny what a single win can seemingly do for players. And I read that and I'm like, here we go. This team is going to string together some wins and some good efforts that are, instead of getting the 5th or 6th pick, they're going to play their way into the 9th or 10th pick, because that's always what happens. And so just seeing that tweet today made me smile, because I was like, man, please don't let this team get some confidence and get rolling.
Yeah, I saw Charlie tweet that too, and I got a kick out of that as well, because it's just it would be fitting, wouldn't it? If they went on a run and made everybody start thinking again, because I wish I could sit there and say it would be a one-off, but I've seen it about 5 other times in my, I haven't been doing this that long, but I've seen it probably about 5 other times. So.
Oh yeah, we got veterans. Dan's been following 30, Chef is 40, and I'm over 50 years of following the Flyers. So, yep, we've seen it.
Oh, and here's the thing, because your show, I believe your show did tweet this last night, I believe, because you guys so nicely tweeted out a birthday wish for me.
Oh yes,
my 30th was yesterday. So yes,
wow.
So there you go. So guess what? I got 30 years of watching it too. I only have 8 covering it exclusively, but I do have 30 of watching it, and I'm used to way more of this than as you guys can relate. So for sure.
Absolutely. Kevin, thanks so much for coming on, and look forward to having you on again soon.
Absolutely. My pleasure, guys.
You take care. Okay, so gents, Kevin had a lot to say there. That he had 4,500 words in the article, so that's not a shock. We're going to kind of wrap up. I just want to do some housekeeping here. For just a few, as we look forward, there have been some good news stories this year, and I didn't want to leave the show with just dwelling on the conference and not without mentioning that Cam Atkinson is one of the good moves that the Flyers made, that Chuck Fletcher made. 17 goals, 18 assists. He's a +10. He's got 3 shorthanded goals, 4 game-winning goals. I mean, G kind of coming out, and G had some tough years a few years ago, but he's maintained his level and in turn his value. The return of Carter Hart. We saw Isaac Ratcliffe look like an NHL player, at least in 10 minutes of action. So, it hasn't been a waste. And I guess going forward, going back to our last show, the Flyers Fan Survival Guide, there are some things that we can be grateful for even before the trade deadline and just try to sit back and enjoy when we watch these games.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Atkinson's just such a bright, shining part of the team. He's always smiling. He's interacting with fans on Twitter. It just seems like a good dude, right? Like, it's fun having him on the team. And we all love Giroux. And I'm glad you mentioned Isaac Ratcliffe. I mean, he was a second-round pick who Ron Hextall traded up to get. It takes bigger guys longer to develop. He's had a lot of injuries in the minors. He really hasn't shown a whole lot in the minors, but he's still only, 22 years old, 23 years old? Like
22.
There's a lot of development left with him. And so it was nice seeing him come up and play well. And, you know, as much as we kind of talk about how we know that it would be better for this organization to lose games and get a higher pick. I mean, when I'm watching the Kings game, I can't help but, be, rooting for them to win the game and end this losing streak, because we're Flyers fans. And so as much as we kind of know that losing is the right thing from a standings and draft pick perspective, it's fun to be able to root for these guys. And guys like Atkinson, like the hustle that he had on that shorthanded goal, like guys like Atkinson really make it easy to root for this team.
Yeah.
So hopefully it's a fun rest of the season. I don't want them to go on a big run and ruin the draft pick potential, but hopefully they keep it a fun team to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Flyers did hire a professional assistant coach in John Turchetti, and he was at practice today. Although when he got hired, he had to go right into the COVID protocol. So, again, a little reminder how everything, one step, two steps back kind of year it's been. And when they win the game against the Kings, Chef, it was the last game in January. So they had to win, or they would have went winless for the month and winless for the year so far. So at least they accomplished that.
It was a nice thing it was actually nice to watch a game where they won, wasn't it? And like you were saying, I mean, Ratcliffe he's somebody I always talked about. I mean, You go back a year or two, I've been talking about him, and like Dan said, it takes a lot for the big guys to cook, so to speak. And he's 22. He looked pretty decent. I'm not going to say but one thing I noticed, and I think Dan can attest to this, and when he was playing before, he's a big guy that never played like a big guy. But in that game, he had 3 nice, big, legal hits. And they were, the crushing one was somebody tried to get him right in front of the Flyers bench. I forget who it was, and he kind of just laid into it, and he knocked him down. There was one that was behind the net in the offensive zone, and then one where he came back in the defensive zone and had a good back checked, and a good, nice little check there too as well. I think that can only improve. It adds another level to his game because that's not something that was touted in his resume. Remember, he was a goal scorer. He scored a lot of goals when he was younger. So, and he never really used his size to his advantage. I think that whatever they're doing with him in particular, they're incorporating his physical assets into his game. And I think it could be something to look forward to from him.
Yeah, I noticed that he was able to take a bad pass out of his skates and seamlessly get it onto his stick. That's a skill play. That speaks to what he was able to do in juniors when he scored 53 goals in the OHL. And when he did get a shot, I think he surprised Jonathan Quick with how hard it was. And look, there's going to be skill elements, but if he's not really moving the needle at the AHL level, and they look at him and say, well, the only way you're going to make it is to use some of that physicality, then so be it. But a lot of ways, like Nick Obe-Kubel, who has a good shot and it can be, a good player showing some skill as a second-round pick, he's got to add some of those elements, and I think that'll help get him there. Now, he only played for 10 minutes, had a lot of adrenaline. I don't want to get it overly exuberant, but it was just after all these years of drafting all these guys in mid-6 or below by Hextall, and to see how we had to bring in guys like Brassard and Yandel and the defensemen like Connaughton. This is what's been killing them, because you would expect by now some of these kids would have been able to fill in and you wouldn't have such a dip in talent, but it just hasn't come together. So Ty Forster has begun to skate, And Chuck Fletcher says they want to get him a few AHL games before the end of the year. He's coming off a shoulder surgery. So hopefully he can do that and use that as a springboard toward next year. So I think that kind of wraps it up. The Flyers play against Winnipeg. They host the Jets tomorrow at the Wells Fargo Center. And then they have off 8 days for the All-Star break. And they play Detroit on the 9th of February, at Detroit on the 12th of Saturday night. I will be away. I will be out of town the rest of this week and into next week. So we won't see you again until the 13th or 14th, Sunday, Monday. And I guess we'll leave it right there. So, Dan, why don't you give people your social media coordinates and if you have any final thoughts?
So folks can find me on social media at dsilver88. My final thought was going to be that Charlotte O'Connor tweet, but I got that in a little earlier than that. No final thoughts. Hope everyone has a good week, and hopefully the Flyers can have an entertaining game with the Jets before the break.
Yeah, absolutely. Chef?
Yeah, you can find me at Chef the Left B on Twitter. I'll gladly go back and forth with you, even if I don't agree with you. Like one person that tweeted at me, I still won't block you. I feel like everybody's voice needs to be heard. I'm not one of those people, so great. But also too, I hope Giroux has a good time at the All-Star game. One maybe the last one as a Flyer. Correct?
Yeah, could be the case. And you can follow me, Isaiah, at Isaiah ISAIAH _520. Don't forget the _50. And sometimes people agree with me and sometimes they don't. And listen, there's a lot in the air right now. We're all kind of frustrated. We all want to move on with things. And until a couple weeks from now, good luck, go Flyers, and take care.